Hi again in Beyond the Ballot. Today we are hosting Melkar on behalf of the Lebanese organization Abad, the Resource Center for Gender Equality, whose work has recently focused on the emergency hotline for women and girls, the campaign against sexual harassment, and the abolishment of Article 522, which allows the rapist to marry their victim. Soohee will also be joining us from Korea. She is the project coordinator for the APGF Women Network Advanced Gender Equity Training Program, alongside being the counselor of the Women's Committee and Gender Equity Committee for her Green Party. Today's episode will be focused on the challenges that women face in attaining gender equity and the initiatives and advocacy that individuals and organizations have been taking in Lebanon to help out in mending these gaps. I'd like to start this episode with some quick background information on the current situation in Lebanon. Melkar, what challenges do women currently face in Lebanon, especially on the level of gender-based violence, which is on several levels embedded into our laws, be it psychological, physical, sexual, forced marriages, all of which are included in the work that you usually conduct as Abad?
So thank you for inviting, first of all, and happy to join this call. Pretty much you named all those challenges. So I would rather think of the overall context. So in addition to the classical or traditional sources or causes, such as the patriarchal system, the negative masculinities, and legislative frameworks and other. As of probably 2019, things have got worse than they used to be with the economic disaster and the economic collapse, the weakened state institutions, the pandemic, the spread of the pandemic, and the weak capacities to respond to this. So mainly challenges could be summarized at a number of levels: economic, physical, safety and protection, legislative, and then participation, access to services, to decision-making, to rights, specifically now that services and rights are being a problematic issue given the scarcity of resources that are still available and accessible to everyone. If you wish, we can go more into details later on, or according to how the discussion is going.
I actually want to ask to what extent the situation has been exacerbated by the economic collapse, but then also by the pandemic and the lockdown, because one of your campaigns has focused on this particular subject, which is the increase in domestic violence after the lockdown and with people being confined within the same spaces without being protected.
Yes, of course. To start with the pandemic part, we witnessed a shocking rise in the number of reported cases through hotlines between 2019 and 2020. As the lockdown started in Lebanon in 2020, it was approximately 110% more than it used to be in 2019 during the month of March or April, if I'm not mistaken. So yes, the lockdown was a cause for a rise, among others, for GBV cases. Our response was to switch the GBV case management into a remote mode. So new SOPs were designed for all caseworkers and respondents to be able to answer those challenges. Again, let me just highlight one thing, that even with this rise in numbers, we are not sure if this is the exact, or if it reflects reality, because we believe that there are so many cases that are underreported, either because of lack of access to channels, or because of fear or stigma, or because simply people lack awareness about whether this is a GBV or is something normal to happen or not. With the economic situation, the economic collapse, of course, this is impacting women, girls, and the most vulnerable, as the labor market is shrinking. Job opportunities are being less and less accessible. People are unemployed. Stressors are increased. Mainly, this is highlighting again the traditional definition of masculinity and the power balance between man and woman. And unfortunately, our first reaction as a human being is to resort to negative coping mechanisms. So violence is on the rise. drug abuse, and other, I mean, negative coping mechanisms. So yes, there is a rise in violence against women and girls. There is also an issue with the accessibility of women and girls and vulnerable groups to services and rights. As I have used the term GBV, probably it would be good to have a quick definition. So it is any form of violence that is being conducted against someone because of his or her gender roles. We know that this is how society has raised us, and this is the expectations that the society would draw for us as soon as we're born. So I'm a man, there are a set of characteristics that I should abide by, a set of reactions that I should respect as well for women, for girls, for boys. So any form of violence that I'm exposed to because of those characteristics or expectations is gender-based violence. This in brief, in a simple way.
And what are the challenges that you face with the increase in the numbers of cases of gender-based violence in your case management? Now, with the lockdown challenges and with basically all the other challenges that are faced in the country, how has that affected your case management?
With the lockdown, as I said, we had to switch to the online modality because of the lockdown. Now, challenges were, as I said, at the level of access to remote services for victims, the fees of internet, because during the lockdown, the economic crisis started worsening. So internet fees were increased, sometimes because the victim is confined in the same room or the same place with the perpetrator. There is no possibility for them to reach out to us. Adding to the fact that, and that was the topic of our campaign for the 16 days of activism this year, that within the overall context in Lebanon, the general impression is that, okay, violence against women and interpersonal violence are something that shouldn't be allowed, but this is not a priority now. Priority is to secure food, to secure personal safety. So we are also challenged with this approach or this understanding of this reality to say that no, I mean, personal safety, physical safety, protection from GBV is a priority. So those are mainly, and then add to it the fact that state institutions are being weakened or are taken by other imminent urgencies, as I mentioned before. So ISF response, the judicial response, were depending on the overall context as well.
ISF, to clarify, in this case, to
Internal
those who are not based
forces
in Lebanon.
Yes, yes. So they are cooperative with capacity building activities that are being conducted with ISF, especially from Abad's side and other entities as well. But again, yani, the overall context was abnormal. Yet there were some cases where there were breakthroughs, but as I said, we suspect, not to say we're pretty sure because we don't have the data, and no, there are too many cases that are still underreported.
To what extent are these cases based on the lack of laws to protect women versus their existence, but their lack of implementation?
Well, it's a combination of everything, I would say. So you have some laws that are not that are not perfect, as we say. They would still need to be revisited, updated, to be more gender friendly, human rights friendly. Sometimes it's about the personal interaction of the complaint receiver or the complaint responder to the victim. Sometimes it's about the system, the administrative and judicial procedures. So yes, there are now judges who look into family issues and family violence, into domestic law, I mean, and to domestic violence. But then again, sometimes their capacities beyond issuing a ruling are limited because of the context they are within. So as I said, it's a combination of everything.
That's a very interesting point there. The whole thing with the underreported cases, I've heard, so I live in a rural area. So most of the rural areas, they still have this social behavior of accepting violence within a marriage and violence within raising children. And I really don't have the skills to explain how wrong this is and actually convince the people. And I was actually wondering, how do you explain it to people who were raised uh, in, into accepting and practicing violence on those levels, especially also like lately, it's not physical violence anymore, it's mental violence, it's
Agreed.
psychological violence.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So how do you deal with this? I don't know how Abad deals with this, so this would
Yeah,
be a
so the
very
best way
interesting one.
is to go through awareness raising by deconstructing the elements of violence, as you mentioned.
Mm,
So it's not only restricted to physical violence, it goes up to moral, verbal, economic, and other forms. And by conducting awareness raising activities, by engaging local leaders or influencers who are siding with the cause that we're combating for. But then again, yani, one has to keep in mind that this is a cumulative work. As you
mm,
said, we're receiving those reactions and perceptions are being passed from one generation to the other. So it is impossible to reverse the process within a week or a month or a year.
yeah, of
So
course.
this is a cumulative process, but the main pillar of this is working on awareness, spreading awareness, and engaging community actors who people look up to help you promote those new values or this new approach or this new concept or whatever you're advocating for under the umbrella of gender-based violence, gender equality. Voila.
So in the case of and it's very unfortunate that I have to say this, but there are many cases that I know, but are not being reported because no one will actually help us. My case cannot be helped, or any other type of reason. Um, how is one person how is a person supposed to act, like in order to help out? I don't know, are they supposed to help out? Do they reach out when even the victim is not really ready to reach out for help? Like how are people supposed to deal with this part?
I mean, you need to start with raising awareness by this. I mean, by promoting the tools you have and the channels that you have to receive complaint. You have to explain more to raise awareness about the process, how it goes, about the rights and the minimum guarantees that are in a way or another available in the present law. As I said, it is not the perfect one. It requires more work, but at least you have a legal tool now that needs to be developed as we go along, definitely. Can you force someone to benefit from the services that you're offering? My guess is that you can just shed the light and say, we're here in case you need support. And yes, if you have concerns, we're ready to explain more, to be more cooperative, to see how we can assist without, because any intervention we're conducting should be guided by the principle of do no harm as well, specifically when the victim is suffering from an existing harm or an existing threat. So this would be the best way to go about this.
How
I
do you
mean,
support someone in the case where they live with the perpetrator? I mean, in the case of do no harm, because then that person possibly seeking help or support would automatically result in a reaction that is happening within their same household. How do we mitigate that?
usually you can start with the personal contact. If it doesn't work, you can bring things up to as they should be to file a legal complaint before the internal security forces to get the perpetrator arrested or separated from the victim. But again, يعني, it's a case by case. You cannot have a one size fit all recipe. In case, يعني, as I said, the reaching out, trying to suggest a solution does not work, then you could go through the legal channel.
I want to ask a question about the overlap between your work and that of the internal security forces. I know of cases that date more than a decade ago, where people who are going through gender-based violence would go to المخفر الدرك. So are these ISF,
the police station, yeah.
Yes. So people suffering from GBV would go to police stations to report what they have been going through. And then people there would just ask them to shut up and go back home. Now, I want to know that there has been some legal reform which forces people in police stations to handle these cases differently. But do we know of how this legal reform has actually influenced these cases and the overlap between that and someone calling you for support?
There is a noticeable change. I mean, the examples you mentioned or the timeline that you mentioned 10 years ago, a decade ago, laws were not passed yet. Capacity building activities that were being provided or conducted with the internal security forces were still probably embryonic or limited. Of course, the reaction has changed in the sense that more awareness exists within the internal security forces personnel. There are rules, regulations, SOPs, referral systems, how to handle a case, how to refer it to the judicial authority. But then again, as I said, sometimes even if you have the tools, it's again about the mentality of those who are involved in the overall context, be it the victim, be it the respondent, be it the judiciary. And as I said, it's a cumulative process. So things, as much as we want them to see, we want them to change, with the click of a button, things will take time, but at least you have the structure. And as Abad, I mean, we're working, as I said, on GBV case management, on WGSS, that is Women, Girl Safe Spaces, on emergency shelter services. So sometimes our intervention, or most of the time, our intervention is a life-saving intervention, specifically in complicated cases where the victim is not capable, let's say, to react immediately to the danger that is being imposed on him or her, or has no direct access to a service. We're intervening through those services.
One of the things that the victims would think of, especially when they're within the same house as the abuser, they would think, what if I leave the house? I have nothing to live off from, and I have no way to go about life. So, Soohee, my question to you, as the Asia Pacific Greens Federation Women Network, how does the Women Network prepare women who are within the Asia Pacific to create their own path, either through the political side or through any kind of creating their own projects, creating their own path in life?
I think there are two parts to my answer to your question. The first part is we do not thus far have engaged in any direct, any project that directly influence the lives of the local communities of our member parties. The establishment of Women's Network and the focus of it was to empower women in a way so that they would be encouraged to participate. In that regard, we provide a lot of trainings. We provide a lot of channels for them to get access to different funding opportunities. In case they want to engage in any political campaigns, any political training, any political structural reforms within their party, such as establishing Women's Network or Women's Wing, who in turn would build their own capacity to reach out to their local communities, to do a lot of campaigns that would directly influence them and their livelihood. So now going back to the Women's Network, we do have our network is pretty solid in a way that we encourage each of our member to collaborate and be in contact with each other so that they'll be able to share knowledge, know-hows, for instance, case studies on campaigns. What are some of the initiatives they had that were effective in tackling some of the issues that we are discussing today? So I think that would be how the international community here, the APGFWN, is engaged in the lives of the women in the Asia Pacific.
One of the things that recently happened in the Asia Pacific Greens Federation is that there was a policy on grievance and sexual harassment policy. Can you tell us more about that?
I think there's a long way to explaining how that came about. But to be briefly introducing them would be this. So APGFWN was established in 2015, and in 2017, starting from 2017, the Australian Greens International Development Committee and APGFWN have worked on developing something called the Gender Equity Toolkit. The focus of the Gender Equity Toolkit is to provide practical tools aimed to help APGF Women's Network and APGF member parties to have better understanding on gender equity and how to implement it in their party. In so doing, we developed something called the APGF Women and Gender Equity Policy. So that was the beginning of all policies that was designed or that was initiated from the Women's Network. Along with the Gender Equity Toolkit, so Gender Equity Toolkit began in 2017, and the next year in 2018 December, APGF Council decided that we together collectively need to have something that's more forward-looking. That was the Gender Equity Action Plan. The Gender Equity Action Plan, the focus of the plan was to make sure that gender equity is something, a principle that each Green Party abides by and is committed to implementing within their green politics.
I just wanted to ask, how aware were the participants that joined the project on that were trying to implement the Gender Equity Toolkit and the projects that were promoting the gender equity and the building the skills and the awareness on what it is to have gender equity? How aware were the participants during those events?
I will not generalize because there are a lot of different paths and walks of life in our participants. But I believe that there was a general understanding on what gender equity is because they lived a life where that itself was violated. They did not have gender equity. So in that aspect, they had something to go on. They knew that the situations they face or some of the frustrations they encounter within Green parties and being engaged in a lot of green campaigns and green movement showed that this cannot be gender equity, that there needs to be more rooms for women to be represented equally, women to participate as candidates, women to be in leadership. So in that aspect, they understood what gender equity is. Now, their question was not really on what gender equity is. Of course, some of them would not have had information coming from international conventions or definitions, like fancy definitions as such, but they knew what gender equity was. It's more about, but their focus was, or their questions were more about how do we implement it? Now, so that's why we created policies. First, in a party, you need policies to make sure that women have positions, women have power. That when it comes to co-leadership structure, for instance, you need to have it implemented. You need to have it in words, enshrined in the constitution of the party. So, but these are important words that you really don't have experience drafting. So that's why we created template policies, first for, as I said before, women and gender equity policy. And now We are drafting a lot of other policies such as grievance policy, prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. Safe meeting procedures, candidate selection procedure, gender quotas, implementation, and code of conduct. Now, after we had policies, that wasn't enough, obviously. So we needed to train. We needed to provide these women some sort of training. That's where mentorship program came, which is one-on-one mentorship program where women who have experienced in creating or establishing women's network within their parties would be in direct contact with another woman who wished to understand the process and who wished to practice it. Now, once that's done, we thought that that's good enough, but no, meeting with these women and talking with them. Exactly. And, asking them some feedback on what else do you want? They had ideas, and one of them was gender equity training. Gender equity training. So one was to train the trainers so that, women could go back to their party and train other women on what gender equity is and what we need to implement. So that was one. Another part of it was to understand what kind of sources, what kind of channels you have to go through to get funding so that you'll be able to have training. You need money to, conduct training of any sort. So, but you cannot do it on your own, especially if your party believes that, creating a women's network is not much of a priority when it comes to funding. As we know, Green parties are not that rich in many countries. So it's something that was important. So we then would, talk to the Australian Greens International Development Committee for funding for the gender equity training locally and nationally.
We mentioned data a while ago. To what extent do we suffer from a lack of access to data in both countries? Official data on gender-related problems.
In the case of Lebanon, data has always been problematic for a number of reasons. That is, on the one hand, fear from stigmatization and retaliation. The different data collector agencies or data hubs that sometimes numbers are not compatible, or because of lack of information sharing, sometimes because of lack of awareness from the side of victims or witnesses, their awareness about the act itself that needs to be reported, or about the rights or the existing tools through which they can report those. And sometimes, as Aya mentioned, in certain communities or with certain context, people would look at some things as being normal. This is the usual family business, how things are being run in the family or in the community or in the biggest network or circle. And again, as I said, sometimes it's also a political matter. In the sense of really political matter, I can share one experience. I was reading a book by a prominent Lebanese producer who worked on movies, series, and other things. At one stage, he's citing that they decided to go for the reality TV shows, but to do it by focusing on social issues, right? Not the scandalous, sexy item things. And in one story, they were covering the question of a violation, a serious violation, where an institution was involved. So this, because in Lebanon things would go usually through the general security. So the episode was voted by other institutions who are similar to the institution that was responsible for the violation, because apparently within those institutions, there were as well similar cases. So sometimes reporting is also a political matter, a question of sectarian balance, of different forms of balances. So this is in general the situation when it comes to statistics or numbers.
And the political power of those who are in positions of power within these institutions.
Exactly. Their political power, their affiliation, sometimes the lack of legislation or enforcement of administrative procedures with regards to specific matters could also be an obstacle to reaching an ideal situation.
Soohee, what about access to data in Korea, but also mostly in your work within APGF, in the Women's Network, access to data from different political parties, the data which you needed to be able to draft those policies?
To first talk about the case of Korea, it's the same in Korea as what Melkar said. Many times police, for instance, women would call the emergency calls or the police, but they do not categorize women's calls as, call to be protected from, threats. They sometimes would belittle or dismiss these calls. So the same would happen in Korea, the same cases where the law enforcement does not protect who they're supposed to protect, and they do not accumulate data based on what really happened. And there are hurdle of police reports and cases because even when the police receives calls, they still find like domestic violence, stalking, date crimes, sexual violence from kin, friends, and etc. Those close by as private and personal. So they do not intervene in the right time. And so the same is happening in Korea. And recently, Korea had many cases of digital sex crimes where a lot of information would be shared online or through the so-called the dark web. And these cases are not reported because they're dark web. We do not exactly know exactly to what extent the information and personal data and personal information, images, videos are being circulated. So in that aspect, there is that lack of and the inability of the state to have a complete understanding of data when it comes to sex crimes or sex-related crimes or gender-based crimes and violence.
Before we move forward, there's been a mention of both words equity and equality several times so far. So I just wanted to shed the light on the difference between both words and which one would be better used in which context. So would any of you be able to help with that?
We tend to use gender equity more in the Women's Network because we do not believe that it is yet for us to use the word. It's not time for us to use the word equality just yet. Equity, as you know, is a term that identifies, addresses, and recognizes the need for differentiated treatment and benefit and measures to those marginalized in our society, those powerless in our society. Equity indicates that it's not about providing the same opportunities. It's not just about providing the same benefits and same rights. It really should be about providing more if there are needed, and so that people can be on an equal leveling field.
I would just need to highlight one thing. I have nothing further to add to what Soohee said, but rather it's a question of as well the need to instill the principle of equality. So yes, in your immediate response, you should go, as was mentioned, according to each needs or obstacles or challenges, but at the same time, instilling while doing so the ultimate goal or the ultimate end of this reaction, that is equality. So sometimes, as again, it depends on the context and the analysis that is being done. Sometimes you could have those track work in parallel.
As we progress through this conversation, I would like to reshed some light on one of the issues that we face in Lebanon on an institutional and societal levels, which have been covered in policies that have been drafted in APGF and in similar networks, but with which the battle is still ongoing on a societal level, and which are being fought by Abad both on the level of the society and the institution. So if possible, I'd like to shed back some light on child marriage and domestic violence with the way they have still been prevalent across Lebanon and within its communities. Because I would like to ask about the most effective ways to fight them beyond policy. And especially that these aggressions and these forms of violence are also embedded within the religious system and the religious community. So I would like to ask, to what extent the religious community has been behind them, and the levels to fight to support these women beyond the policies that are drafted in that regard.
On the one hand, the question of child marriage is problematic at the level of the family status law, because as you know, in Lebanon, we have several religious family status law. We don't have one civil family law. And things will vary. The extent of rights and obligations would vary from one religious court or religious system to the other.
Can we go into the details of that? The minimum required age to allow a woman to get married, a girl to get married, as per different sectarian laws?
Actually, if you look across most of the religious laws, religious family laws, marriage is allowed for boys and girls under the age of 18. Sometimes this is seen in some family laws as an exception, or is let's say limited with very strict conditions. In other family laws, they are the rule or the base that yes, marriage can be conducted as of the puberty age or a specific mentioned age. Usually, it's kind of, it is difficult to fight or to lead a fight against or to lead a suggestion for change when religious texts are implicated. You cannot change the text probably, or specifically within certain religions such as Islam, for instance, because these religious rules are extracted from the Quran itself, and the Quran is unchangeable. What can be done, and this is Abad's experience at this level, is to raise awareness and to lobby with, yes, this is policy and not policy as well. I will explain how. To lobby with religious leaders and religious institutions while shedding the light on the risk factors, on the hazards, on the protection issues, and the results or risks that a child marriage, be it a girl or a boy, will encounter later on, the implications and repercussions of such an act. A few years ago, probably in 2013 or 12, Abad did launch a campaign to include religious leaders and institutions in the fight against for violence against women. Now again, this is also coupled with, it's a cumulative process, with raising awareness, conducting activities that are related to spreading information, casting the light on risks, conducting interventions, imminent interventions in specific cases where there is a risk factor. But again, it is a cumulative process. Certain religious leaders will be receptive of the message and will try to see how to make things go according to norms. Some others would not, would opt probably for a classical or traditional interpretation of texts. So as I said, the response would vary from one institution to the other, from one religious leader to the other.
Has there been any progress on that front? In your communications with religious authorities?
There is a progress. So for instance, within the Sunni sect, the age texts are still the same, religious texts, but by practice, the age for Hadani, I lost the word. It will get to my mind. So the age for, sorry?
Kindergarten?
Hadani is
the right to custody. The age
custody.
of the right to custody has been raised. The age of marriage, by practice, is being established as being the age of adulthood, right? With other institutions or sects, things are not as clear as this example. So that was an example. Sometimes the issue lies within the court itself, or the legal system that is being applied by the court. I'm not sure that there is a track record for statistics or numbers, but there are still cases where child marriages are being conducted, specifically now because of the economic situation, because of the possible threats or risks. يعني if I were to think like using a traditional approach to this, I would say yes, it is better to marry my children, or if I had a girl, even taking the risk that she's not adult yet, because I cannot afford protection, food, safety, education, blah, 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 which are important, blah, blah, blah. I'm not undermining all those factors. So sometimes people would think of this option as an exit strategy, not necessarily driven by a religious law or by a legal system. But يعني, even if, as they say, hell is paved with l'enfer est pavé avec de bonnes intentions. So again, going back to the main principle, it is an awareness work that is being conducted by engaging again religious institutions, influential figures in communities, working with women, with men, with everyone that can influence the course of how things would go when conducting a child marriage, to prevent those, I mean.
I want to ask a question about these campaigns that you have conducted with public figures and which reached, they had a very wide outreach across Lebanon.
How much efficient it is? It is sometimes interventions are life-saving. Sometimes, even if you're capable of just offering a safe space for a victim, even if this is temporarily, because we need to keep in mind as that civil society, and Abad as part of the civil society, at this level, are providing services which are supposed to be run by the state. And I think Soohee would agree as well. So between the capacity of the state and actors and entities, the capacity is limited. You cannot compare the capacity of a state with the capacity of an actor or civil society to those of the state. But again, it's a question of priority and perceptions as well.
From child marriage to policies and their impact on the civil society. The Women Network has a political influence along with a social influence. It hasn't been it started out, 5 years ago? Was it launched 5 years ago, I think? So the projects are still new. So we can't really say how much did they actually impact the societies, but what is the Women Network expecting of what kind of change is the Women Network expecting from the policies that they ask the Green parties to adopt, to the work, the projects, the trainings that you're launching in order to help the women in the Asia Pacific region?
As a network, our projects and policies, or the template policies that we designed, are focused on providing skills development and opportunities for women who wish to engage in green politics in their region. We believe for women and women issue, what's personal is what's political. Measures and policies to protect women's rights and encourage them to be politically vocal about the agendas and issues that matter to their local communities are pivotal aspects of empowering women on different levels. For instance, many projects of Green Party women's networks involve providing safe spaces for women, educating women on how to prevent and protect themselves against violence, helping them to gain a political voice as ballot holders, and ensuring them that the fact that they are overburdened with the care labor and other social expectation can be the very reason why they have to stand, and they need to stand against patriarchy in solidarity with the global network of women. So all in all, we, like you said, our projects are relatively new, and we haven't have a social we haven't monitored on our social impact. However, we do get feedback from the participants of the gender equity training. We do get feedback from parties on the fact that a lot more women locally are engaged with green politics because they see that that's more hopeful. that they find women issues and they believe women as, important constituents for politics. So in that aspect, we see that there ought to be changes socially as well.
Melkar, with as much light being shed on sexual and gender-based violence currently in Lebanon, with all the work that you as an organization have been implementing, and also similar organizations, but then also with all the increasing challenges. So with the exacerbation of all the existing problems that have contributed to the increase of instances of sexual and gender-based violence, do you have any expectations on where things are heading?
So when it comes to the aspiration of Abad, to answer your question, first of all, we're hoping to, or the work is geared towards increasing awareness, engagement of all who are involved or have a positive influence on this front in order to be able to influence legislation, administrative work, because it is not only a question of providing or the existence of legal texts or services. It's a question of accessing those texts, those services, having the appropriate tool and environment to see a smooth and efficient implementation of those laws, and to be able even to revisit and update those laws as needed. And ultimately, the main drive is to be able to ensure equality for everyone.
And with that in mind, but also with a worsening situation in Lebanon, can we have expectations about specific communities more than others starting to lack access to services? Because we know that access to phone coverage is going to become more expensive, access to internet. And usually the poorer and more unable to access these services people are, it also means that they will not be able to contact you if anything is needed. Do we have any expectations for the upcoming period and how to mitigate the situation?
I mean, we're trying to be prepared as much as possible to face all possible scenarios and to ensure that our response is not interrupted. Specifically in extreme cases of GBV and other forms of violence against women, girls, and other vulnerable individuals or groups. To answer your question of which communities are we expecting to become more vulnerable than the others, I think the comparison nowadays will be between vulnerable and most vulnerable, because everyone will become vulnerable in a way or another. But again, the most vulnerable are those who are already living or suffering from harsh conditions, such as marginalized groups, refugees, people who have minorities, people with specific risks or possibility of risks. So those will be the most vulnerable. And as I said, we're trying to cope with this negative change that is haunting us to be able to ensure that our response remains uninterrupted.
Do your projects usually cover queer communities?
This falls under the LGBTQ in general.
Yes.
And again, yes, this remains kind of a taboo or a stigma, the way the society looks or interacts with this community. The good thing is that there has been more discussions brought up front in the public sphere about LGBTQ, but then again, it's a question of being able to change the laws and to ensure a more relaxed environment where those individuals and groups can access services rights without stigma, without prejudice, without being exposed to physical danger or harassment or other.
I think I'd like to wrap up on this conversation by asking a question to the both of you regarding what, Melkar, you would think the international community can support with. There has been the ongoing support that we get from the European Union or similar donors. which GBV projects in Lebanon usually run on. But where do you think we can also increase exposure or perhaps exercise some lobbying? Where can the international community support the local one, which you think they can focus on a little bit more?
On a personal level, I don't think you can impose change up down, right? It's a process that should start at the bottom, and it's a build-up process. What the international community could do is to maintain its support, specifically at those levels that we discussed. Nowadays, probably the focus is at the economic level, the security level, and other levels that are mainly impacted on the surface by the economic crisis that has hit Lebanon and the political deadlock. But this does not negate that those topics, GBV, vulnerable groups, services, access to services, be on the agenda as well, because at the end of the day, the more those rights, services are available and those groups have access to those services, the less tension is. Part of the social tension that we're witnessing now as a result of the scarcity of services and other resources that are needed is the tension between communities, local as Lebanese and non-Lebanese, or local communities within themselves, as they fight and struggle over access to those resources. So the more we highlight this and the more we're ensuring an equal access with no discrimination, with lessened risk and violence, the more this will contribute to the political and financial stability as well. So it should be there on the agenda somewhere.
Soohee, what about you? Where do you think the international community could be of support to the Lebanese community, but then also of support to the Korean community? So perhaps we could answer this by talking about you from the standpoint of international community and the way you think your policies could be of support here, but then also the kind of support that you would need as local community from the international one.
One thing that Korean Green Party always focuses on when we introduce the works of the Global Greens or the Asia Pacific Greens Federation is that it's a global network. It's a regional network in solidarity. And the fact that we, as in Green Party Korea, is still considered to be a minority party, and a lot of the public believes that Green Party is only about environment and should be only about environment and should not really look into issues of feminism, issues of queer communities and sexual minorities and their issues. Is something that we always have to struggle to convince, struggle to convey, struggle to maintain with our stance. When there, even internally, there talks about us have talks about asking us to focus more on green issues. Now, but the fact that we are a member of a global network of parties is a very big element that we rely on, the know-hows on campaigns, all the work that they have done, all the work other Green parties have done, all the work other Green parties are doing with us. Because as we know, issues of, just like how issues of climate change, issues of environmental protection are something that a single nation cannot solve, the issues of patriarchal system, issues of capitalism, issues of a lot of things that we as Greens focus on is not something that can be bound in the borders of a country. It's transboundary, it's very transnational.
Thank you both for being with us today. This has been such a rich session. And Melkar, thank you also for being part of this session on behalf of Abad. I think the insight and the information that you have provided has been so valuable that it needs to have more light shed on it. Because I think for the most part, we have been aware of the challenges and the problems that women and girls face in Lebanon, but not the extent to which we actually face them. So thank you so much for being with us and for all this insight that you've brought into the conversation. Soohee as well, the work that you've been doing is amazing. And being able to discuss the challenges that we face but also on the level of policy and the work that you have been doing, and which we could build on in terms of how to bridge the gap between societal problems and policies. Thank you so much for the insight that you've brought into this conversation. Aya, would you like to add something before we wrap up?
You're always very good with your words. I think you covered most of it. Thank you, Melkar. Thank you, Soohee. You were awesome. And thank you for sharing your knowledge, observation, the data that you have that we all should know. Yep.
All right. Thank you and see you soon.